20-year-old king wakes up inside the Grand Palace, and before the morning is fully alive, he is found dead in his bedroom with a gunshot wound to the head. And from that moment on, Thailand is left staring into the same wound, asking whether King Ananda Mahidol was murdered, whether it was an accident, whether it was suicide, and whether the truth was buried long before the case was ever called finished. This episode contains discussion of violent death, disputed historical evidence, executions, and political trauma. What you're about to hear is built from documented reporting, historical records, court history, and later scholarship. Whether record is contested, incomplete, politically shaped, or still argued over, I'll say that plainly, and I won't fill in gaps just to make the story cleaner than it is. Later, there will be a clearly labeled speculation lane, kept separate from the verified timeline, and not presented as fact. The first thing to hold on to is that Ananda does not enter this story as a symbol. He enters it as a person. He was born in Heidelberg in 1925, spent much of his youth in Switzerland, and when the throne came to him in 1935, it found a schoolboy living far from Bangkok, not a finished monarch, waiting inside the machinery of court life. A regency council had to govern in his name. That matters, because it changes the emotional temperature of everything that follows. Before this becomes a palace mystery, it is the story of a boy who inherited history before he had lived enough life to choose what to do with it. And the Thailand waiting for him was not gentle. The monarchy had already been cut down from absolute rule by the 1932 revolution. Power was being reorganized. The military was rising. The state itself was being remade. Ananda's childhood and adolescence unfolded while other men argued over what Siam, then Thailand, would become, and while the institution wrapped around his name was still trying to recover from humiliation, political fracture, and the long aftershock of losing old certainties. So even before the gunshot, there is pressure in this story. Not cinematic pressure, structural pressure. National pressure laid quietly on the shoulders of someone still growing up. What survives in the more careful historical telling is not an image of swagger. It is almost the opposite. Smithsonian described him as a slight and painfully shy boy. And that detail is useful because it cuts through the myth haze. You can feel immediately that he wasn't built in the public imagination as a conquering personality. He feels softer than that, more interior, more like someone who had to be carried by duty rather than someone intoxicated by it. That makes the story sad in a different way. You are not looking at a ruler who seemed carved for spectacle. You are looking at someone who still feels, even across the decades, unfinished. A lot of his actual becoming happened away from Thailand. Britannica's historical account places him in Switzerland as a schoolboy, while a regency acted for him, and World War II kept him from returning to take up his constitutional role in any full, lived way until after the war. That distance did two things at once. It protected him from some of the immediate chaos back home, and it also separated him from the place he was supposed to embody. So he grows up in one world, while his meaning is being manufactured in another. That split helps explain why he never feels fully fused with the throne. He feels like someone still trying to grow into a life that had already been arranged around him. And there are hints of a more private life there too, though this is where I want to stay careful. In later scholarship discussed by The Diplomat, Thai academic Pavan Chachavalpongpun argued from Lausanne archives, university records, and a postcard that Ananda had a relationship with Marilyn Ferrari in Switzerland. and that the palace regarded that attachment as threatening. I wouldn't lean on that the way I'd lean on the Regency, the war, or the simple fact of how young he was. But I do think it belongs here. Even if you set the palace implications aside, it reminds you that he was not only a sovereign in waiting, but a young man with studies, attachments, private hopes, and maybe even a future he could imagine beyond ceremony. By the time the war had ended and he could finally return to Thailand in real historical focus, he was still standing at the edge of adulthood. That is the version of him I want sitting in the listener's mind before we move deeper. Not a verdict, not a body in a room, but a young man standing at the edge of adulthood, while the country looked at him and saw continuity, healing, and maybe a calmer future. The tragedy lands harder when you start there, because what comes next does not take an old institution at the end of its life. It takes a life that still feels like it had barely opened. And even the way Thailand has remembered him tells you something about that unfinished feeling. His brother established the Ananda Mahidol Foundation in 1955 in his memory, centered on supporting Thai students in advanced study abroad. And even in 2025 official commemorations were still marking what would have been his 100th birthday. That does not solve anything. It does something quieter than that. It preserves him, at least in part, not only as a death inside a palace, but as a life interrupted before it had fully become its own, which is where this part of the story should leave us, with someone who had been asked to carry a nation before he had fully become himself, and with Bangkok waiting for him in ways neither he nor anyone around him could control. Then the story narrows into one room. On the morning of June 9th, 1946, inside the Baromphimon throne hall in the Grand Palace, Ananda was waking into another day that was supposed to lead somewhere. According to later historical reconstruction, his younger brother Bhumibol said he stepped into Ananda's bedroom around 9 a.m., saw him resting, and left. About 20 minutes later, a gunshot cracked through the palace. A page, Chit Singh Hossaini, ran into the room, then out again, calling for the Queen Mother. When she came in, her son was there, shot in the head, lying face up in bed. He was 20 years old. That is the moment the story stops being private and becomes something heavier than grief. Not because a king has died, that alone would have been enough, but because almost immediately the death refuses to settle into one shape. Reuters notes that official investigations and 3 court verdicts ultimately said Ananda was murdered. But even with that, the case never achieved the feeling of clean resolution. It achieved a ruling. That is not the same thing. The room was real. The shot was real. The certainty was never real in the same way. And that matters for how we tell this part. Because no, the killer is not known in any honest, settled sense. I'm not going to fake closure where history never earned it. What Thailand was left with was this. 3 palace officials found guilty as accessories to the king's murder and executed in 1955. They pleaded not guilty. No one else ever stood trial. So if you ask the deeper question, who actually pulled the trigger and was the case truly solved? The hard answer is that the historical wound never closed. The state produced punishment. It did not produce consensus. The investigation itself became part of the mystery. Reuters reports that the first police line blamed a plot linked to Prime Minister Pridi Banamyong. But that claim did not hold in any lasting moral sense. Pridi later went into exile and was essentially rehabilitated by the Thai state decades later. Smithsonian's reconstruction shows how unstable the process looked even then. The case dragged for years. The evidence against the secretary and the 2 servants was widely seen as weak, And yet pressure for a final answer kept building until convictions were finally secured and then upheld. So this is not just a death investigation. It is an investigation moving through politics, power, fear, and the national need to force a shape onto something that may never have fit neatly into any official version at all. What happens next is where one death becomes a national wound. Once Ananda was gone, the issue was no longer just what happened in that bedroom, but who would get to define it and what that definition would justify. In the immediate aftermath, the state moved from uncertainty toward murder as the official answer. And that answer carried enormous political weight in a Thailand already strained by post-war instability and competing centers of power. The case moved through the courts for years, and even that long process never produced the feeling of a truth cleanly found. Smithsonian notes that the lower courts would not convict because there was practically no evidence against the men being held, while the Bangkok Post timeline records that Chaleo Patumros had been acquitted by the criminal court and the appeals court before the Supreme Court finally convicted him, alongside Chitsing Aseni and Bhutta Pathamasarin in 1954. That matters because it tells you the legal story was not one smooth line of discovery. It was hesitation, reversal, pressure, and then finality. And once that finality arrived, it arrived hard. The three were sentenced to death and executed in 1955, still insisting on their innocence. That is part of what keeps the case alive. Punishment came, but peace never did. Around all of that was politics. Smithsonian adds the broader atmosphere, censorship, fear, a commission under pressure, then the post-war coup environment in which accusation and power were already feeding each other. So the death of Rama VIII did not just leave a hole in the palace. It became material in the struggle over Thailand's future. That is why this story still breathes. Not because the facts are simple, but because they never were. Reuters reported in April 2024 that a Thai court was hearing a petition to reopen the case, driven by a new challenge to the old regicide finding and an attempt to clear the name of one of the executed men. Whether that effort succeeds or not, its existence tells you everything. Nearly 8 decades later, the official verdict still does not sit quietly. The room in the palace is gone into history, but the argument that came out of it never really left. That is where the story leaves us. Not with closure, because closure would be dishonest, but with the shape of the wound. A young king dies. The state declares murder. 3 men die with the accusation still on them. A nation keeps looking back, and the deeper you go, the more you realize the next part of the story has to step outside the court record and into the fog that formed around it, because that fog is part of the history too. Now we step out of the court file and into the fog around it. What follows is not fact. It is the public argument that grew around a case many people still believe was never cleanly settled. One lane says it was an accident, not a plot, not a planned killing, just a terrible, irretrievable mistake involving a pistol and a morning that went wrong in seconds. That theory survives because accidents feel human, and because people still look at his inexperience, the chaos of the scene, and the contradictions in the original investigation and think, maybe the state could not bear an answer that ordinary. In some public discussion, that accident theory widens into a still more explosive variation, involving someone else in the room, or someone close enough to the inner circle to be shielded from the record. That is where rumor starts slipping away from evidence and into the deep water. Another lane says suicide. That is not a fringe idea anymore. It was openly revived in the 2024 court petition by Kungwal Budivanid. who argued that new ballistic and forensic work supported the possibility that Ananda shot himself with his own gun. Reuters noted that those claims were not independently verified, and that matters here too. Still, the theory persists because it offers a closed circle. The weapon near the body, the private burden he may have carried, the sense of a life under pressure, and later writing that tried to connect his emotional world in Switzerland, including discussion of Marilyn Ferrari, to the possibility of despair. That does not make it true. It only explains why the idea keeps returning. Then there is the murder lane, the oldest, and in some ways the widest. Not just murder in the narrow sense of a single hand pulling a trigger, but murder as part of a larger political necessity. This is where people start saying the 3 executed palace officials were scapegoats, that the original investigation was bent by power, and the post-war Thailand needed an answer more than it needed the truth. Reuters notes that scholars have challenged the official narrative for decades, arguing the investigation was not transparent and was mired in the politics of the day. That is a big reason the case never died in public memory. Punishment happened. Certainty did not. And once people stop trusting the official story, the rumor field opens all the way up. Some public arguments point toward Preedy and the political enemies circling him at the time. Some point toward anti-Preedy forces who could benefit from turning the king's death into a weapon. Some discussions wander into palace internal suspicion. Some drag the younger brother into the frame. Even in serious public history discussions, there is no consensus, and probably never will be. That does not validate every theory. It shows how deep the fracture goes. When a country loses confidence in the first explanation, it starts manufacturing replacements, and each one says as much about fear, ideology, and memory as it does about the dead. That is also why this case still feels dangerous. Reuters reported that more than 24 books have been written about Ananda's death, that some circulated in Thailand, and that others were banned. The Diplomat went even further, describing the subject as one long-forced taboo, and noting that newer generations have returned to it precisely because it was suppressed for so long. So when the case resurfaces in online chatter, in exile scholarship, in reopened case campaigns, or in those quiet corners of the internet where people try to say what older Thailand could not safely say out loud, the energy is never just curiosity. It is the energy of something people believe was sealed before it was understood. And that is where I want to leave this part of the story, outside the verified room, outside the verdict, outside the reach of anything I can honestly call proven. Because the theories matter, but mostly for what they reveal. Not certainty, not closure, but a nation still circling the same mourning, still trying to decide whether the truth was lost, buried, or never allowed to live in public at all. What stays with me is not the argument, it is how young he was. A 20-year-old king carrying a country that was still trying to decide what it was, and never getting the chance to become anything beyond possibility. The court spoke, the books kept coming, the theories multiplied. But underneath all of that noise, there is still a life interrupted, and the mourning Thailand has never been able to set down. So let it end there. Not in certainty, in respect. If this story stayed with you, follow the show wherever you listen, and stay with us. There are some histories that do not loosen their grip because they were never allowed a clean ending. And sometimes the most honest thing we can do is keep listening without pretending we know more. Sources for this episode included Reuters. Thai author seeks to reopen probe into 1946, death of King Ananda. Smithsonian Magazine, Long Live the King. Encyclopedia Britannica, Ananda Mahidol, and the Last Absolute Monarchs of Siam. Bangkok Post's historical timeline entry. Death for Chaleo, Chit, Bhuta Supreme Court ruling brings curtain down on 6-year trial. The diplomat, Pavin Chachaval Pongpun, on the strange death of King Ananda Mahidol, and a moderated Ask Historians discussion used only to reflect the range of public historical debate, not as a primary source for the verified timeline. Until next time, remember King Ananda Mahidol first as a life interrupted, before it had the chance to become fully his. Where the land remembers what others try to forget,